Hi everyone. This is the second lesson in which we're going to apply the sociological perspective to deviance. In this lesson, the question is, as you will note on page 16 in your third study guide, what are the functions of deviance? Although it may seem a little strange, unusual, may strike you as kind of far out and funky, deviance can be useful to society. Many sociologists, including Robertson, have argued that if it's kept within reasonable limits, it can literally help to maintain social control and social stability. These sociologists have been powerfully influenced by the work of Emile Durkheim. Durkheim highlighted the fact that deviance is not without problems. He noted some of the major dysfunctions, as have later sociologists. Can an extensive amount of deviance disrupt social order? Well, of course. On the other hand, if deviance is widespread, could it confuse social norms and values? Can it divert valuable resources? In other words, more time, energy, and money have to be put into its control. And can it also undermine or violate the trust that people have in the overall social system? Well, absolutely. So Durkheim, when he was arguing about functions, didn't suggest that deviance is just wonderful, we ought to run out and embrace it. But he did point out the fact that a certain amount of deviance is necessary. So let's look at some of the functions that he identified. The first is that deviance helps to clarify, to affirm cultural values and norms. In other words, deviance is necessary to define the limits of what is permitted behavior. It's used to define and to maintain morality. By defining some acts as deviant, we, or the members of a society, are able to create a clearer, a more distinct boundary between what is moral and what isn't, between what's good and what isn't, between what is right and what isn't. Now, punishment of those who break the rules demonstrates to everyone how far society's tolerance extends on any particular issue at any particular point in time. Occasional violation of deviance is necessary. Without it, the norms might become less clear, might become less strongly held. Deviance not only helps to define, but it also helps to sustain, according to Durkheim, morality. Kai Erikson did a classic study some years ago of witchcraft hysteria, focusing primarily on Salem Village, not too far from Boston. And again, what he hypothesized was that the boundaries of appropriate or normal behavior become a lot more specific and a lot more rigid when there's some kind of a crisis. Now, the crisis can be within society, or it may be perceived of as an external threat. In the late 1600s, there was, in various parts of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, again, a perceived internal and external threat. For some observers and social scientists, the argument was it wasn't just a threat, there were a multiplicity of threats, all giving rise to a kind of generalized moral panic. And one of many manifestations was the witchcraft hysteria. And as is the case with all forms of hysteria, it didn't take long before people came to believe that witches were a genuine threat, and they were everywhere. Here again, a young woman is being examined for the mark of the devil. This is an old portrait of the trials that took place again in Salem Village. Now, Erikson makes the argument that the hysteria helped the settlers of this young colony to more clearly define the boundaries of acceptable behavior in their developing society. Now let's go back and take a look at the second function: solidarity, unity. In other words, a certain amount of deviance can reinforce group unity, a strong sense of solidarity. It can really help to unify people in opposition to what is considered to be a shared threat to their key values and norms. They collectively react against perceived deviance, and in so doing, they confirm their commitment to key values and norms, or they are at least made aware of their commitment to their group or their society. Major deviance can cause the members of a society to react with collective anger. For example, that's exactly how many Americans responded to this event, 9/11. Same was true of the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. Both of these and other events that all of you can probably identify serve to reinforce a strong sense of unity among Americans. I can recall my father, he was still alive when 9/11 occurred, made the comment, "I've never seen the country so unified since World War II." And you got to keep in mind, events like this lead some people to believe that their very way of life is under assault. Now, Erickson's study of witchcraft hysteria figures into pretty much the same. He notes that concern about witches provided the members of a newly emerging society, Massachusetts Bay Colony, with a common enemy. It unified the people in fear. Now, another key function identified by Durkheim has to do with the notion of warning. Literally, again, you can think of deviance as a sort of red flag, if you will. And I want to add something to this third function that he identified. I also want you to think of deviance as being and again, Durkheim kind of alluded to this in a generalized way, it can serve as a sort of safety valve for individual as well as social discontent. Now, as to a warning, signal, or sign, well, extensive or significant deviance may provide an indication of a serious problem within society. Again, a red flag, a sort of, as I have alluded to from time to time, drawing from the argot of the aerospace industry. Hey, Houston, we got a problem here. For example, urban riots among members of some minorities have highlighted over time various genuine concerns and problems. Most recently, again, the relationship between members of some minority categories and the police. Now, you also want to kind of bear in mind that large-scale pattern violation of norms, which involves many or most people in society, may very well indicate there's some kind of a defect. This form of deviance is sometimes referred to as norms of evasion, or Robinson refers to it as institutionalized evasion. For example, there was a lot of that that accompanied the federal government's prohibition of alcohol. You remember prohibition? Okay. This provides a useful example of the point I just made. It, again, large numbers of people, despite the fact that alcohol was illegal, there were still lots of people using it. It became the basis for the emergence of large-scale organized crime. It illustrates the fact that the existing law was basically unenforceable. Now, as to that other point, how can deviance serve as a sort of safety valve? Well, here's the point. People may be allowed to violate rules rather than to openly attack the various social structures the rules are designed to support or to uphold. Now, if that didn't make sense to you, think about this. Some minor forms of criminal activity may be tolerated as a sort of, let's call it, permitted outlet for people who are frustrated. Rather than them outwardly challenging the established political and social authorities, these folks again have a chance to kind of let off some steam, if you will. And the authorities may wink, so to speak, at the acts that they commit. Okay? And in so doing, they kind of reduce the opportunity or the chance that all this frustration might build up and explode. Robertson uses the example of graffiti. Criminal in many communities, it's more or less tolerated, okay, as a way of allowing people who might really get frustrated with certain arrangements in the system. This gives them an outlet where they can let out their deep-seated feelings and attitudes without rattling the cage too much. Now, last but not least, Durkheim argued that deviance can be an important source of change. It can promote change. Deviance, you want to remember, can be a source of creativity, of innovation. It can literally push the boundaries and produce alternatives to the way things are. Some ideas and behaviors that today we take for granted were once thought of as deviant. For example, racial equality, rock and roll music, cohabitation, same-sex marriage, public schooling, and full-time daycare. Now, you also want to remember that some people engage in what's loosely referred to as principled deviance. Socially disapproved acts are committed for a moral conviction rather than for personal gain. Those who commit these acts are not necessarily what some people consider to be your typical criminals. And principled deviance and its resulting conflict can play a very important role in social change. Now, if that's not registering with you, what I'm getting at is the fact that people may violate some rules, some norms, in order to get them change. And anybody who works for change in the existing norms, I think all of you would agree with me, run the risk of being labeled deviant. But these changes may be necessary, and they won't occur unless people are prepared to take such a risk. Now, to kind of illustrate this point and to build further on the idea that deviance can produce change that may become valued, consider for just a moment those who have advocated for change, advanced ideas, principles, policies, practices, in their time considered to be deviant, but today are widely embraced and advocated. As a matter of fact, many of us incorporate some of the ideas that these folks produced, or we admire them greatly. You know this particular woman from the old woodcut? Joan of Arc. This woman in her time was considered to be a serious deviant. Susan Anthony, early advocate for women's rights. More recently, this woman was conceived of as being a deviant, advocating also for women's rights. Maurice Steinem. And Betty Friedan, another major player in the movement. Some of you might recognize this remarkable American, Rosa Parks, who refused to take a seat in the back of the bus and initiated what's called the Civil Rights Movement. A major player in that movement was this gentleman, long regarded as a deviant, spent time in jail, Martin Luther King Jr., and this individual, Malcolm X. The civil rights movement spurred on other changes, particularly with respect to demanding civil rights for other American minorities. Cesar Chavez was a major leader of the civil rights movement for American Latinos and Hispanics. Again, in his time, considered to be a deviant. And what about this individual, Nelson Mandela, who really was responsible to a great extent for initiating, in many respects, the breakdown of the apartheid system. He alone didn't do it, but he was a major player. And many of you know he spent a lot of time in jail. Let me ask you also about a couple of other people. There was this dude from the city of Mecca. He has a remarkable experience with the angel Gabriel, and he becomes aware of the fact that he is the final prophet, the bearer of the full truth of God. His name is Muhammad. He was considered a crazy. He got run out of his own hometown. And what about that carpenter fellow from that dusty little village down in Nazareth? You remember him too, do you not? Again, these are all individuals who in their own time were considered to be deviant. But today we advocate and incorporate our lives around many of their ideas. One final point that I want to drive home. Another function that I want you to take into account: social control. Remember that the threat of being labeled deviant may work to keep members of a group or a society, so to speak, in line. If one strays too far from the expected norms, guess what? They run the risk of being considered an outsider. Dangerous. Erickson's research on the witchcraft hysteria that swept through Salem Village and parts of Massachusetts Bay Colony in the late 1600s notes this key function. Almost all of those accused of witchcraft in Salem Village were considered to be people who had violated some kind of an important social norm. The majority of them, if you remember, were women. And most of these women were single. One, however, that was accused of witchcraft had married, but had married a younger man. And she was accused of turning over all of the goods she'd inherited in wealth from her first husband to him, and not passing it to her eldest children. So again, the threat of being labeled deviants in some form or fashion may work to keep people in line. We'll pick up on another approach in the next lesson, applying the sociological perspective to deviance. See you then.